Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our monthly Mornings with O'Keeffe program. I'm Katrina Latka, Curator of Education and Interpretation at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. I would like to begin this morning by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront ongoing injustices of settler colonialism. And now for some Zoom housekeeping. If you've not already done so, please introduce yourself in the chat box. To find the chat, go to the bottom of your screen and click on the chat button. If you're using an iPad, the chat can be found at the top of your screen. The chat box will then appear, and then you can click on chat. Above this, you'll type in your message, and you have the option to send a message to everyone or just to the panelists. Please also utilize the chat box for questions throughout the presentation, of which our presenter, Freya Grand, will answer at the end. You can close the chat box by clicking on the X in the upper right-hand corner. If the chat box is in the middle of your screen, you can move it around your screen by clicking on it and dragging it and holding it down with your mouse button. And closed captioning is also available. To turn this on, click on the CC button on your screen, which is located at the bottom or the top, depending on your device. I would like to also extend a big thank you to our members and our donors today, which with your support have made this event possible. If you're not yet a member and enjoy this program, please consider joining today. Visit gokm.org/membership to learn more. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for this morning, Freya Grand. Freya lives and works in Washington, D.C., where her urban home and studio are within walking distance of one another. She's a native of Madison, Wisconsin, and received her bachelor's degree in fine arts at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, followed by advanced studies in oil painting in Intaglio. Grand has been a working artist all her life. She lived for 3 years on the remote Queen Charlotte Islands in northern British Columbia in a cabin with no electricity or running water. This period of her life, living on the land and existing within the naturally dictated rhythms of each season, laid the foundation for her sense of closeness to the forces of nature and her appreciation for both their beauty and their danger. Grand travels and hikes with Earth's untouched and sometimes rapidly changing landscapes. Her constantly growing body of work transports, immerses, and emotionally engages the viewer, distilling and enhancing our perceptions of Earth and of ourselves. Grand's artwork has been exhibited at numerous galleries and museums on the East Coast and in the Midwest, the most recent being a solo exhibition at the Art Museum of the Americas in Washington, D.C., and at the National Museum of Women in the Arts in D.C. Her website is www.freyagrand.com, and I'll place that in the chat in a bit. Without further delay, our guest this morning, the wonderful Freya Grand. So over to you, Freya.
Thank you, Katrina. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Good morning. It's an honor for me to be able to join you this morning for this breakfast with O'Keeffe. I just want to add to Katrina's introduction that, oddly enough, I come from a family where adults never sat on the ground if they could possibly avoid it. That was something that was for children, and it was something you were meant to outgrow as you aged. I did, however, very fortunately grow up in a neighborhood that had some tiny patches of woods, which to the eyes of a child were large and mysterious. And I really can't remember a time when I wasn't immersed in a kind of private sense of the magic of the natural world, like many children, but I carried it into adulthood with me. When I was quite a bit older, my father had a life-changing epiphany when he discovered the great solace of nature. And as that became an increasingly important part of his life, he passed that love and that enthusiasm on to not only my sister and I, but to anyone else in the family who would listen. My work begins in the outdoors. Like many artists, my creative process is something that has evolved gradually over time with a lot of trial and error. It begins out there somewhere, and it culminates in my studio in the middle of the city in Washington, D.C. And so this morning, I'd like to describe to you how I do that work and what lies behind it. I'm going to be taking you on a bit of a visual ride through many different places and through some of the paintings that grew out of my times in those places. And as I prepared this presentation, I realized that there was some danger of it starting to feel like a rapidly revolving door. So I just want to tell you that these journeys are usually at least a year apart, and that in the intervening months, I typically do 8, sometimes 10 large oil paintings, and often a grouping of very tiny ones, tiny oils on cradled panel. I work until I feel that that particular train of thought has run its course, and it's only then that I start thinking about where I want to go next. The very wise poet Mary Oliver said, "Instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it." For me, it all begins in going to remote places in order to see and experience landscapes in their wild and unaltered states, and to record my impressions. My choices of locations have a certain serendipitous quality to them. Sometimes they're based on things that other people, other travelers have told me, or something I've seen in a movie or read in a book, or it's just some kind of intuitive attraction. I'm beginning with this photo taken at Mount Fitzroy in Patagonia, because for me, it encapsulates so much, beginning with the rigor of getting there, which in this case was a 4.5-hour, fairly steep ascent on trails, being greeted at the top by a 50-mile-an-hour wind that was whipping off that glacial lake, which is why, as you can see, previous hikers assembled that temporary wall to give people something to hunker down behind while they ate their lunch. My foot's hurting, so I've taken my hiking boot off, and my bag lunch with its smashed sandwich is waiting for me. And I'm rummaging in my pack for my travel diary, my notebook, and my pencils. And behind me are those incredible peaks. And while I may look relaxed and casual on the outside, on the inside, I am jumping up and down with exhilaration because I know that this place is really something. Months later, these are a few of the paintings that grew out of that trip to Patagonia. go out there because what I'm looking for is wildness. I'm looking for whatever gives a place its unique character. As you can see, I like to go to environments that are dramatically different from each other. And that means that in each new environment, there's a visual learning curve. I'm not going back again and again to a place that's become familiar, like an old friend, letting it reveal its secrets slowly over time. That's a time-honored way for painters of the outdoors to work, but it's not been my way. And so in the beginning of a journey, I'm really assaulted by new impressions, and I feel as if my mind doesn't yet have a category for it, doesn't yet have a place for me to file all of that flood of information. It takes me time to settle. It takes a couple days of hiking and staring and drawing before I feel like I'm really seeing. I remember when I first arrived in Namibia, which is where this pile of rocks was located. I remember thinking, oh no, there's nothing here. It's too vast, it's too empty, it's too dry. And then it kind of opened up and I was able to find my way into it. I don't take painting equipment with me, oil painting equipment, when I travel. It's just not practical for the places that I like to go. And my final work is done in my studio weeks, sometimes months later, where I will have to sort through and resurrect a lot of memories. So in the beginning of working this way, my greatest frustration was realizing that the whole sensory experience was at its sharpest and most intense at the moment that I was there, and that it faded rapidly over time. It got paler, especially with intervening travel and time zone changes and new experiences piled on top of older ones. And so it was really important for me to evolve a way to preserve the freshness of those initial experiences beyond just taking photos with a camera. And so my travel journals became an essential part of my process. Now, after working this way for quite a number of years, I feel that it's actually better. I like it this way because many of the places that I go to, I will only be there once. I'll never be able to get back there. And so while I'm there, I want to gather as much information as I possibly can. And that requires being able to record it fairly quickly. This is a place in northern Namibia where there were endless miles of dunes and these low black rock outcrops. No roads, no signs of any kind of humans, of any kind of human intervention. I was traveling that day with a small group, 4 people and a guide, and we were driving these little individual dune vehicles called quads, which allowed us to get really deeply into remote places. I convinced the guide to leave me alone on the top of a high dune for an hour or so. And he hesitated at first because obviously this violated every protocol of tourism safety, but he did agree. And he left me with a satellite phone in case I needed help, and threw in a couple of extra bottles of water just in case. And then he took the rest of the group over the next hill. And the moment that everybody else disappeared over that first dune, the silence was immediate and profound. The only thing that I could hear was the sound that sand makes as it moves across the surface, a kind of whispery, crackly sound. It felt to me like time had dropped away. Everything that I was familiar with had dropped away. And it was a little frightening, but mostly it was exhilarating and extremely beautiful. I had time to just sit there and absorb it and look and to draw and write some words. When you look at this little diary entry, it doesn't look like much. There's a modest sketch and a few scribbles. But for me, these 2 pages are really dense with meaning. And years later, when I look at it, I can remember exactly what it felt like to be there. What I carry back with me to the studio through these journals isn't just the view, it's the feeling of being there, it's the vision, it's the visceral impact. The beauty of Namibia lay in these hundreds of miles of creeping sand and the silence. And like in this portion of the country called the Skeleton Coast, which is quite an evocative name, these sinuous ranges of garnet colored mountains that look like they're pushing up through the ooze of the sand. It was a landscape that made me so acutely conscious of its inherent danger and so acutely conscious of not only the safety, but the extreme luxury of being able to travel by modern conveyance and to have plenty of food and water available. Some of the places that we went there were only accessible by small plane. Sunrise and sunset were the best times to be there, not the heat, the white heat of midday that just obliterated every shape. Being practically alone in a place like this always makes me feel like I'm looking at features that are there as the result of eons of change, beginning with a tectonic shift and ending with the daily erosion caused by windblown sand. And I thought about the fact that I was looking at things that hardly anybody else had looked at, these places that have been going on about the business of just being for eons, for longer than the human imagination can take in. And then I was the alien visitor there. Most of the places that I visit invite exploration on foot. In fact, they require it because the hours of walking really allow me to absorb the sense of a place so that when I paint a mountainside, I can remember what the surface felt like underfoot or how it smelled or what the air was like. And the physical effort of getting there also helps to inform my visual memory. I'll be able to recall that this was the place where we sort of half slid down a rubbly slope, or that was the place where the bog water came up over the tops of our boots. This painting comes from a very boggy place. This was in the Highlands of Scotland in an area called Glencoe. And it was literally a vertical bog, so that in the ascent from the base of the valley up to the bottoms of those sharp peaks, you were stepping or hopping from one hummock of coarse grass to another, and these hummocks concealed standing water in between them, so that if, like you were momentarily distracted by how beautiful that fog is, you'd find yourself standing up to your ankles in cold water. It was a damp and lonely landscape, and it emanated a kind of historic sadness along with the great beauty. Rain and mist, they're the air of Scotland, as any of you will know who've been there. The shapes tell a story, the directional lean of a peak, or the rhythm of the hills, or a sliver of a lake, or as you can see from this shot and the way that my hair is standing on end, a fairly strong prevailing wind. I've spent a fair amount of time in Ireland. That is one place that I have returned to, and that's where the shot was taken. I'm especially drawn to the coasts there, those dark rocks and that agitated sea have such a somber beauty and such a pull for me. And when I'm there, I can't help but think thoughts about timelessness and the relentless power of the ocean, and the long history of man's relationship with the sea, fraught with danger, but also providing sustenance, beauty and tragedy, all wrapped around each other. All that history woven into the landscape and emanating from it. I first went to Ireland as a result of a conversation in my studio many years ago with a newly made Irish friend, Maeve. And when I said to her that I felt like I was on a lifelong search for gloomy and evocative landscapes, is I think what I said, her face lit up and she said, "Oh, have I got the place for you?" And she was so right. I've always been so drawn to the eloquence of the shapes there. A very different place. This was the Boneyard Lake Rookery in the Pascagoula Basin, river basin in Mississippi. I had written to a naturalist friend of ours to ask him if where he and his wife lived, there were any cypress swamps. And he wrote back and he said, yeah, everywhere. So a few months later, our friend Pete guided us in kayaks into this amazing cypress swamp where we were able to paddle in and around those cypress trees and the strange and sinister looking knees that stick up above the surface. Islands of floating algae and a kind of glimmering water. It was an amazing place. And the stillness of the water made it possible for me to prop my journal on the bow of the kayak and to do this sketch and quickly record those shapes, the cypresses and the knees and the branches, and write some quick notes about how humid the air was and how it was filled with the clicking and chirping and whirring of frogs and insects, how it was just teeming with life, like the literal primordial soup. in the process of pouring myself into what I'm seeing in a new place, most often it's the shapes that I respond to first, the structures, the ribs and the folds. This drawing and the next one that I'm going to show you were done in my studio, not on site, and they were done in preparation for painting. These drawings that I do aren't large, they're maybe 6 or 8 inches across. And although I may do quite a number of them before I feel like I'm ready to begin painting, I never develop them any further than this, because it's important to me to keep that further development for the time when I'm painting. It keeps the process fresh for me. And as I'm drawing, I'm retracing the journey in my mind, rereading my notes, looking at my drawings, and reviewing my photographs. The arc of the journey ends here, at this point, when I'm painting. And when I'm moving my brush over the canvas and establishing, laying in the directions of the movement and the juxtaposition of the shapes and the way that various substances press up against each other, like fog against rock. Because at the moment of seeing, when I'm out there, there's mostly the exhilaration of a wordless connection, a kind of recognition of some sort. The full understanding comes later as I'm working on the painting itself, as I travel back over that terrain, but this time with my hand. I'm reminded of how Keeffe talked about making something really hers. She was referring to the Pedernal, which is a range of mountains that she painted many times. I've never taken that statement of hers to mean that she felt a sense of either ownership or exclusion. I've always understood it to mean a kind of joining, a sense of becoming infused with such an understanding of a place that later its story could flow out through your hand in the form of a drawn line or a brush stroke. In Iceland, I was able to take a helicopter ride over some of the mountainous glacial areas along the south part of the country. In the past, I had often created an imaginary bird's eye view because I really love the sweep of shapes. But now here I was actually able to hover over this landscape of ice and crevices, and the crevices looked like they were rushing toward the horizon, as if the horizon was sucking them in that direction. And to be able to look down into this split open ice sheet that was dusted with volcanic ash from eruptions that had occurred a few years before. This aftermath of an enormous Earth event. Iceland was kind of like Namibia in the sense that it's a raw, stripped down landscape. And like Namibia, it took me a little while before I could feel like I really was seeing it, really comprehending it. The helicopter experience occurred at the end of the trip. And while it was one of the most fantastic things I've ever been able to do, also vital to my sensory memory of a place, my sensory memory of Iceland, were the many days spent hiking across the expanses of tundra vegetation and rubbly rock. Again, it's a kind of body memory that will contribute to my visual memory later. I have a tradition which I always observe, and that is my daily sandwich shot. This is a photo portrait of lunch set against the background of wherever I am. And I thought you might enjoy seeing this extremely helpful signpost written in Icelandic. I'm going to show you two more preparatory drawings. These are both drawings done in my studio after returning from Iceland, and you can see how quick and kind of smudgy and gestural the drawing is. I was really taken by these rivulets of glacial melt that formed shallow braided rivers and flowed from those really lonely looking mountains in the background down through a flat valley of gray volcanic ash into the sea. This place again gave me that feeling of what the earth does when it's just being itself, when no one's watching. There isn't a logic to the patterns of my trip, so I can't relay a narrative that connects them one to the other than just to say that the desire to see something is replaced a year or so later by the desire to see something else. And so in that spirit, this painting and the next one are from Hawaii. Here, not that slow movement of melted glacier water changing the shape of the landscape in tiny incremental ways, but here was the frightening and active power of creation and destruction, the power of erupting gases and molten lava. This was, again, a view from a helicopter, which made it possible for me to peer down into this active crater. And that was wonderful because the helicopter didn't have any doors on it. I was able to smell the sulfur and to feel the heat on the side of my face. And this place nearby where those molten lava streams flow into the ocean. And the hot lava would meet the seawater and throw up plumes of toxic, acrid steam. And the waves were beating against the base of the cliff. I don't think I've ever been any place where there were so many forces colliding with each other at the same time. And later that day, I was thinking about how hard it is to comprehend that forces like this go on even after we've left, that even at night, when it's dark, when your eyes are closed, it's still going on into the foreseeable future until something changes or shifts direction. I realized that that's a somewhat childlike thought, but I think it has a kind of universal quality and probably points to our inability to get out of our human-centric way of looking at things. There's no doubt that this kind of drama is seductive and irresistible. And it's only one kind of story about the earth and one visual vocabulary. The truth is that I spend most of my time in quiet places. Woods are full of mystery, the tangled roots and the mosses and the way the light filters down through the canopy. And here in this place, this iconic rock that looks like it dropped in from outer space. Even though I knew about erratic rocks and how receding glaciers leave them behind, I have to confess that when I first looked into this woods and saw that rock, my first thought was to wonder how it had gotten in there. As I shift my focus from one part of the world to another, and as I consider such different ecosystems and geologies, I can sense how my thoughts are different in different places. Rainforest thoughts are different from volcano thoughts, which I guess is in the end why I seek out such different places in a search for not only variety, but balance and a desire to comprehend the fullest range possible of what this planet offers us. Namibia was sandwiched in between 2 yearly trips to coastal Ireland. And it was after my time in Iceland and over a year and a half spent painting that I had the desire to see something so radically different as the cypress swamps of Mississippi. This idea that the natural world provides a kind of container for thoughts that we don't have or can't have anywhere else. It's not an original thought. There've been many brilliant writers about the landscape who have made that observation and talked about how nature inhabits our deepest consciousness if we can put ourselves in a position to see it and be quiet. There's a Scottish writer named Nan Shepherd who wrote, "The landscape arches its back and bristles," an image that I love. In her writing, she hints at a kind of pantheism, which has always appealed to me personally. But even if you don't lean in that direction, for many of us, there's an awareness that there's a conversation that goes on between what we see in the outside world and what we're feeling within ourselves. The writer Robert McFarlane said, "The landscape is not something to be viewed as if it were a passive object or some kind of stage set just made for us to tramp around on. It's serious, it's dynamic, and it shapes us." For me, like for so many others in the rest of the world, travel came to a grinding halt in 2020. And so I was unable to go to the remote places that I loved going to. And I had to bring my attention to what was closer at hand, which for me is the banks of the Potomac River and the forests of the Shenandoah National Park, places that I could reach on foot or on my bicycle or by car. It's been a time of real emotional intensity, a time of limitation, a time of tightened focus. And it's been a time when I've been even more acutely aware of how important it is to me to find the expression of emotional states in the natural world. I realized that there was some kind of an interesting reversal that was going on. And that whereas in the past, I would see things that unexpectedly triggered an inner conversation, things that were a catalyst, now things were turned the other way around. And I was searching for places that reflected what I was already feeling. And there's been huge solace in that. John Muir said, going out was really going in. So I tell about my own personal experiences in my work, not to suggest that I feel that they are unique to me. In fact, I think there's a huge shared commonality among human beings that we are all deeply wired to respond to nature and that we all need it. As a final thought, I'd like to bring in the idea that artists whose work expresses a love for this planet have been becoming part of the general cultural conversation about protecting Earth. And that we've learned in the last couple of decades, I think, that people's attention is best attracted by stories and by the evoking of feeling. And after all, it's artists whose daily work is to translate feeling into tangible form. And so I consider myself to be a part of this conversation. There's an organization that's based right there in Santa Fe, the Barry Lopez Foundation for Art and Environment, whose mission is to bring artists into the conversation about climate change. The writer Barry Lopez, as you may know, wrote poetically and powerfully about our natural world in his books, such as Arctic Dreams. And he felt passionately that artists are one of the most effective ways of bringing attention to our planet. And this is just a little final afterthought, but I thought I'd show you two paintings that I just completed, both of them done after a hiking trip in New Mexico that included a beautiful day hiking at Ghost Ranch. And now I would be happy to answer your questions.
Freya, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We had so many wonderful questions as well coming in during your conversation, and it runs the gamut. So let's see if we can get through a few of them. Certainly we had folks who wondered about your connections, if any, to Georgia O'Keeffe. So what do you see as your philosophical, spiritual, or simply logistical ties to how Georgia O'Keeffe created her landscapes?
Well, I should begin by saying that Georgia O'Keeffe was born in a town that was only about 25 miles from where I was born. So she was a hearty Wisconsin woman. I think my strongest connection to Georgia O'Keeffe is in that need to find myself in the landscape and the drive to travel, to understand, to keep drawing and painting and working as a way of taking in the beauty of the natural world and telling about it.
Lovely. And how do you select your painting locations? And do you do a lot of research before you go there?
It depends. It's very different. As I mentioned earlier in my talk, I don't really plan very carefully long into the future. It's an intuitive choice. And after spending a year painting about one kind of subject and immersing myself in one particular kind of place, I will feel the desire to see something very different. And people give me ideas, and I see them in books, and I see them in movies. And I will do research. I mean, that's what the internet is for. I'll look at images and then just kind of go. And every trip is kind of a leap of faith because most of the places I go to I've never been to before. So I don't know what's going to be there.
A couple people have now asked, can you repeat the name of the female Scottish poet or the book that you were quoting from?
Yeah, in fact, let me pull out the book.
I'm glad you have it right there.
I do. It's Nan Shepherd,
And Shepherd,
The Living Mountain.
lovely.
Nan Shepherd lived in the Highlands of Scotland. She spent her life hiking the Cairngorm Mountains, which she loved. She wrote eloquently about them. She taught English at a small nearby college.
And several people have asked very logistical questions about how you paint. So for example, do you ever listen to music when you're painting?
I do. And I find that there are different kinds of concentration that are required at the different stages of a painting. So in the very beginning, when I am laying out the shapes and doing the underpainting and establishing the relationships of light and dark, I probably either need silence or music that has no words, sort of trance-like music or classical music that doesn't interfere with my thoughts. But then later in the painting, I might listen to music with words or, yeah, so it varies. But yes, I do listen to music.
And do you ever use photography while you're in the field to capture the image, or do you rely heavily just on sketching?
I do both. I take photographs and I also draw and I write. I will do my drawings while I'm sitting there at the moment, and then every night, very faithfully, I write a couple of pages of what it was like to be there. And the reason I said very faithfully is because I learned the hard way that if I thought at night, oh, I'm too tired, I don't feel like writing, by the next day when I had added on another set of experiences, it was too late. It was like the sharp impressions had a very short half-life. So yeah, so I write, but my photographs are important too. They give me the local color. They can remind me of some geological features, the texture of the stone and so forth that I need to see again. Just a reminder of the place.
And several people noticed that you so often paint in the size format of 48 by 60. Is there a particular reason for this?
I don't know, somehow that just got to be my size. I think I like that proportion. I also have a number of paintings that are square, that are 48 by 48, but yes, that person was right, was observant that 48 by 60 is my most common size. I like it because it fills my field of vision. I can immerse myself into it. It's like, it's big enough to be a little world, and it just suits me. It suits the way my arm moves. But I also do some very tiny pieces, which people could see on my website. I call them distillations, and some of them are 5 inches square. And they are ways for me to either further explore ideas that I feel like I wasn't quite finished with in the large pieces. And they also give me a way of exploring a different point of view, a more focused, sometimes more abstracted way of looking at that set of shapes.
And I guess going back to the very beginning of your presentation, you know, those lovely journals where you capture an image so quickly, folks are very curious about what media you're using. Is it watercolor? What type of materials are you using when you're out in the field?
Yeah, it is watercolor, and that is purely because of the portability of it and the fact that you know, you can clean up with water. You don't have to haul solvents up a mountainside. I don't consider myself a watercolorist. I never studied watercolor, and I never did it much at all until I began doing these travel journals. So they're really just a way of drawing that I'm able to use. I also just use pencil. So yeah, I have a little tiny box of watercolors that I carry and a little portable water reservoir that folds up.
And you certainly spoke to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and just being able to go out on your bicycle and drive and see what's around you. But once that limitation has passed, do you have plans for your next trip? Where will you go?
I don't know. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by what might be possibilities that don't actually quite feel like possibilities yet. I would love to go back to Scotland. There are lots of parts of the Highlands that are even more wild than where I was last that I'd love to see. There are things in Africa I want to see again. I don't know. I think right at this moment, it doesn't feel like overseas travel is quite ready to be possible, but there are many beautiful parts of this country, and I'm sure I'll find myself coming back to the Southwest.
Let's see, there's just a couple more questions at the end here in the chat I'm seeing come in as well. Can you name a couple of places on the west coast of Ireland that feel especially spiritual to you?
I have spent most of my time in County Sligo, and that's the area I'm most familiar with. So I've explored the rocky beaches there, and it's very beautiful, and there aren't a lot of people who go there. Donegal is beautiful. I've been there, and some of the paintings that I showed were done after a trip to the coast of Northern Ireland, Antrim, and let me just scroll up and pull those up again. You know, these were all Irish. Causeway Coast, that's the Giant's Causeway near there. That's a place that many people have probably been. Antrim, County Antrim.
And about how long do you usually stay in one location?
Oh, 2 weeks was probably average, sometimes closer to 3. But I know that seems like a fairly short time, but I don't think I've ever stayed away on a journey for more than 3 weeks, partly because my head gets full and I want to go home and paint.
Have you ever felt particularly endangered by a location that you traveled to?
Well, this morning my husband was asking me if I was going to tell the story of almost being attacked by a wild bull, and I said I wasn't. But that was in Ecuador, hiking with a guide in a very remote place where in the mountains where somebody was raising bulls way back there so that they would never see human beings and would remain wild. And one of these bulls saw us and was not pleased, but we made it. We made it out.
I'm glad to hear that. Well, perhaps we'll end on that exciting note.
Yeah.
And best wishes to you in your future travels. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yes. Have a wonderful day, everyone.